Welcome to Wine Tasting, where art meets science in a sensory journey. It's more than sipping. It's about discovering the wine's complexity and character. See the color, swirl to unlock aromas, smell to identify the bouquet, sip to taste the flavor, and savor the finish. Wine tasting involves techniques like visual examination, olfactory evaluation, and taste analysis. It's an exploration of vintages, comparisons, and unbiased evaluations. Whether a novice or a connoisseur, understanding these nuances enhances your enjoyment of wine. So grab your glass and let's explore taste, texture, and tradition. Cheers to the art and science of wine tasting. Nikki, can you kick us off? What's the first thing that you notice when tasting a new wine?
Well, of course, we're going to look at color, and we're going to look at the olfactory sensation. So we're going to look at smell. And, you know, as long as the bottle is not corked, it's fairly difficult over here to find really bad wines. So if the color's there and there's a good bouquet that may even come out, you know, a little later on after you've opened the bottle, especially if it's not been prepared before, then you should be fine.
And Jin, since you are the expert among us, you know, this is your profession. How do you approach olfactory evaluation?
Well, so we are faced with doing blind tasting almost every week and sometimes almost every day, whether we like it or not, because it's part of our nature of the restaurant that we have built. There's a lot of diners who come out there who want to either, one, show off their wine, or two, share great wine, or three, you know, they'd say, I got something really weird. Can you blind this? And we're always stumped by it. How to evaluate olfactory sensation? Well, there's many ways of starting it, but the first thing that you want to go for, since you mentioned olfactory senses, that you smell for any flaw. That will be the first step that you look for. Is the wine flawed? And the flaw could be saying that, does it have TCA? What we commonly call it is corked. And that would be the first step that you look for. And sometimes you smell for whether the wine is oxidized or if there's some sort of sense of maltorization that happened. And that could happen due to poor storage condition. And especially if the wine is relatively young and you smell something like nutty caramel-like flavors or smell that comes through, then you know for a fact that there's something that happened to this wine, and then there's some sort of a poor storage conditions that happen. So those are the things to look for. And after that, if the wine is sound, meaning that you are free from all this flaw, then you really go into, one, what kind of fruit profile are you detecting? Are you know, especially if you swirl a white wine in your nose, are you getting a bright fruit such as citrus fruit like lemons and limes? Or are you looking for something a little bit richer and deeper, such as, you know, apples and pears? And you could also break that down. And then that's when really the evaluations start to happen. And then after you look for the fruit, you look for non-fruit characteristic, and then so on and so forth. So you constantly go down the line to see how much the wine has to show you. And if the wine has more to show you, the wine generally is very complex. And then, of course, once you do the sight and the olfactory sensation check, and then you go into the palate. And then once you do all that, you evaluate the wine based on if the wine is sound, if the wine delivers joy, if the wine is in balance, which is one of the most important thing, and then if the wine is complex. And then you sort of go down the line once again and deduce what the wine is and what you think the wine is. And most importantly, for people like me who actually like to enjoy wine, if the wine is enjoyable.
You guys are going to empower me to sound so much more cultured than I was before this episode. Can you give us some tips on, like, for beginners, palate identification? Where does one start?
Is that a question for me? Or
yeah, that's for you.
Okay. For beginners, that's a tough one. Beginner is always hard. I think the best way to do it for a beginner is drink with people who has more knowledge than you do. And then that would be, I think, the biggest asset that you carry. If the moment that you start tasting wine with people who know a little bit more than you, but without any sort of condescension, without any sort of I know more than you do, I'm better than thou type of attitude, then you're going to learn so much more. That's why it's always very helpful to taste together in a group setting, because you get to taste a lot of different wines. And as you become more and more advanced in your ability to taste wine, you do a lot of comparative tasting, because most commonly asked question, especially in the restaurant wine list, is you have 3 different wines from 3 different producers, different vineyard or maybe different vintage of the same label. And people will ask you, what's the difference? And I said, well, I could tell you the difference, but it's not going to make any sense. The best way to really learn what the differences are when you do side by side tasting, and then you discuss, and then you break it down, and then you analyze. But unless you're able to do that, I could throw you some general words, and I could say that this particular vintage will have more acid than this particular vintage. But unless you're tasting 2 vintages side by side, you're really not going to understand what more acid is like. Or, hey, this vintage is going to have more alcohol than the other one, but where's the baseline? So you have to understand that. So it's really important to tasting groups, because wine, especially when you enter the realm of fine wine, they're not cheap. They're very expensive. So the more people that you could gather, the better off that you will be.
Josh, tell us a little bit, speaking of vintage, tell us about Renault Winery, because I think many people do not think first of New Jersey as a location for a winery.
I might not be able to finish this thought if my signal drops, but the Renault Winery we purchased, and I just want to thank Jen and Nick for phenomenal, visualizing words that painted pictures for your connoisseur, how to preserve or enjoy wine. But for me, we purchased the East Coast the second oldest winery in America. It was founded in the 1800s. So for us, I imagine at that time in the 1800s, New Jersey having great soils, reminiscent of the area outside of Champaign, with sandy loam. So they called that a good terroir for the whites. There was probably more wine consumed and produced on the East Coast in the 1800s than in California, I think, with the population being outside of New York and the East Coast. But we bought it because it had this great history, French family to thriving during Prohibition through nefarious means, and today being a luxurious resort that our team helped to restore. But most people probably do not originally think of the East Coast. But when you think back historically how the population moved west, it does make a lot of sense that the early settling winemakers would have set up shop on the East Coast. And we were lucky enough to get a person from Champaign to set up this winery. And that's why we have Champaign still to this day licensed. We're allowed to use that word instead of just calling it sparkling wine.
Yeah, that's very rare, I understand.
It is, and we always have to prove our legacy whenever we produce another bottle and a new label. There's a whole legalistic process you have to go through. And so we have to prove evidence of all that history, which is kind of the reason we bought it, because we love the story.
Thank you. Let's move on to segment 2.